Really a big thank you for having me in this long-standing digital history colloquium. And really, it's a pleasure to be able to share my work before you wrap up your semester and go for your summers. Today I'm going to speak about the histories of digital history, especially in the Chinese world, and I'll approach it from several angles. So the first angle will be its emergence, how it came about, and I will argue and show that it really has a pretty long, winding path, one that I will show that has its path dependencies. And the second angle will be about infrastructure, where I will talk about how the digital research infrastructures came about, and especially taking some of the earlier thoughts that I've gathered from my work with the China Biographical Database and use that as one of the examples as how I would interpret the digital research infrastructure for digital history. And finally, I will say some things about the debates that are ongoing. So I would phrase it as the discontents, really critics and debates and scholarly discussions that have been going on about digital history, especially when digital history is becoming mainstream for Chinese academia in history. And really, I try to bring together some of the threads that I've been working on. So, as Anika mentioned, I'm a China historian. I focus especially on medieval Chinese social history, on the history of letter writing, on literati networks in Song China, especially from the 10th century to the late 12th century, early 13th century, and so on. And in that work, I use and employ digital methods. That's how I had my foray into digital humanities and digital history and so on. And during the postdoc, I was tasked uh, with the mission to spread and provide training for those digital methods. So that's how I got involved in a lot of the DH community and capacity building in the Chinese speaking world. And especially after the postdoc, having returned to Hong Kong, I have been extending and continuing that line of work. So really, it's drawing together these threads to share with you what I see in the Chinese digital history space here. And of course, I really look forward to your comments and questions afterwards. So first of all, why do we need histories of DH or digital history in particular? I often go back to this important question raised in Julian Lyon and Andrew Flynn's uh, volume of oral history of DH. There they ask this question and they urge us to pay more attention really to the history of DH itself. And they remarked in that volume, the introduction that we really have not engaged enough the with our own history, the history of the field adequately. And of course, 10 years has passed, and of course, with many initiatives and conferences and projects, including this long-standing colloquium here, we also see lots of reflections on the field and my own work here, I hope, also contributes to that larger discussion, especially on the sort of global and non-Western part of that conversation. And Of course, this is based on the understanding that lesser known DH communities and DH work in languages that fewer scholars operate in are often seen automatically as latecomers to the field. And that, I would argue, is something to doubt. And of course, in the first part of my talk here, I try to show that as well. And I guess we could all agree here that really there is no easy, single, unified definition of digital humanities or digital history. Um, the previous talk in this series, of course, it's redefining, right? Digital history, as you remember. And even if one would desire a unified single definition, it's really impossible to just apply it to every subfield and every culture and every region. So really, it is a plurality of concepts, and in this plurality of concepts, of course, the scholarly context is critical, and it's this global scholarly context that we are focusing on today, especially for how DH and digital history were debated and developed specifically in the Chinese speaking world and in the greater China region. And I would argue that this context, of course, is quite different from academic communities elsewhere, especially where a lot of the other more known DH work is done. And of course, this is partly due to the features of Chinese humanities data, of the language, and so on. So we already see lots of efforts to globalize the field, and lots of conversations and events going on, books, edited volumes, interventions, so on and so forth. And I am casting my net here, especially on the Chinese world or the greater China region, which I would include mainland China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, where I'm now based, plus Chinese studies done outside China, sinological work. And this is for because of the digitalization work and the digital scholarship work in these regions and in these communities are often speaking to each other and having a conversation. In fact, some of the projects are also collaborative efforts between these regions, even though they have been in the time period that we are talking about politically more or less separate entities, more or less, of course, right? Um, and uh, and because I am a historian by training, I'm naturally drawn to questions about history and the history of scholarship. And if we are to focus on that in the past 4 decades or so, digital history is something we really couldn't lose sight of, even if it could seem or sound navel gazing. But I feel really we have to be reflexive on how this subfield of digital history and digital humanities in the Chinese speaking world came about. And so already in the translations here, how DH is translated, you see already 3 translations depending on how the digital is translated differently in Taiwan and mainland and in Hong Kong. So already disparate pathways, you could see how the paradigm and the concept have been introduced into these 3 parts of the Chinese speaking world. So my take on this history is just one of the multiple takes one could have, and hence my plural form in the title. The the research paradigm of DH, I would argue, really is not a completely novel one in the 2000s. So long before then, already Chinese scholars from various disciplines have been doing digital research and scholarship, especially since the late 1960s and 1970s and so on. And this is what I call the prehistory phase of Chinese DH, especially from the more mature phase, 1980s to the 2000s in particular. Chinese scholars have been producing many types of digital research and resources and tools and databases and so on. And this approach of mine is different from some of the other approaches out there, including the one that I'm showing this slide by Anatoly de he traces this back actually to the 1920s, the prehistory of DH, to the Tsinghua School in the 1920s to quantify Chinese history and to reorganize information about Chinese history. So here I am adopting computational digital machines mainly to be the basic assumption. That's why I take a shorter view than the really really long one, dating back to 1920s, especially based on the concept that if we are to take the reorganization of historical information to be a sort of starting point of prehistory, actually it could go all the way back to Sima Qian, right? Already in the Grand Historian, in the early China sort of classic history book, he had already been reorganizing this sort of information. So again, this is just my take, to say the least. So tracing the prehistory of digital humanities, starting from electronic computers. And so the classical and the modern Chinese language, of course, presents challenges to digitize and organize and mine historical data, especially textual data. So for instance, in OCRing, the thousands of Chinese characters and in word segmentation, already there are these challenges. And for word segmentation, of course, it's due to the fact that there are no spaces to mark word boundaries in Chinese text. So as you can see in this page from a pre-modern late imperial Chinese gazetteer here, it just runs, right? It just runs character to character, and it just goes on and on. So there are no word boundaries that are explicit in the text itself. If you just digitize all the characters here and just feed it into the machine. That means there requires a lot of human input, right? Human input in the pre-machines era, that would be the red notes in the page here to the left. You would see these red ink brush writings to be what the reader had put onto the page of the book. These would be annotations while he or she was reading, and the circles here that you would see would be the punctuations that the reader would add as he or she was reading, and at the same time making sense of the sentences and paragraphs and the essays and so on. So this really was the setting of the data, and of course there's the early adoption of block printing, dating back to the 7th century AD, and from then onwards, of course, a lot of the textual material became available in print form. And so most of the material that we are talking about in this prehistory period of Chinese DH would be based on print books, scanning and OCRing print texts, and constructing databases of full text print books, and therefore enabling keyword searches and text mining and so on. Still, OCR accuracy rates are not perfect. Text mining, including the challenges that I mentioned in terms of word segmentation and making sense of the text, are also not yet perfect. But that's sort of the overall big development that we would see when we are focusing on the prehistory until the time when DH really became a paradigm, when it was coined and it was introduced to the Chinese world. So let me sort of recount that story very, very in its skeleton form, in its outline form. So this would require us to go back to the 1960s. And as you might know, especially this is not just unique to the Chinese world, linguists have been among, really some of the earliest people to adopt digitalization and digital tech to study cultural topics. And that's also the case in China. So including William Wang in the late 1960s, already conceived of the idea of inputting Chinese dialect data into computers. So really early stages of computation and linguistics. This idea materialized in 1969, and there you see some of the papers that introduced the project. Basically, it's a phonological study, so trying to track sound change in the various dialects of the Sinitic language. And so just to give you a sense of what it was like, here's the schema. The list here from 1 to 24 is the fields, right? The metadata fields. So what kinds of information for each sound that the project will input into the machine, resulting in, you see, dialects from various places having lots of data there, from Changsha, Peking, Jinan, Xi'an, Taiyuan, so on and so forth. And so DOC, Dialect on Computers, became really a pioneering project, having Chinese material, Chinese humanistic data on electronic machines. This, of course, was a very, very early stage when inputting Chinese and encoding Chinese was still a huge, huge challenge. And that was really the case and quite insurmountable by ordinary humanists until 1980. So the encoding of Chinese characters really became possible or more widespread only in 1980. And that was when these standards were announced and adopted more widely than before. So before then, there were many, many different encoding standards, and only in 1980, Taiwan had this Chinese character code for information exchange, which encoded 4,800 Chinese characters. And also on the other side of the straits, on the mainland, there's the standard also announced, the national standard GB T2312, which encoded 6,700 characters. And it's only after these codes emerged that they have become relatively standardized and the conditions become right, that the digitization of Chinese texts are doable. So especially in the time leading up to then and also after that, a group of linguists experimented with the use of electronic computers to calculate the frequency of words used in various corpora, including in modern Chinese novels, in Chinese textbooks, and in modern Chinese language usage. So these are Chinese corpora established in mainland China, and I've indicated the number of characters in these corpora. So it's this scale that we see advantages of using computers as opposed to analog, and also as opposed to doing it by humans manually. So all these are for modern Chinese. So you see also the trajectory. Right? First, starting with modern Chinese, which the usual common use of characters, the number of characters is of course smaller than the classical version of the language. Then, as for pre-modern materials, it comes slightly later. So beginning in 1984, Taiwan, the Central Research Institute there, Academia Sinica, began this project called Scripta Sinica, which digitized the standard dynastic histories. This, of course, would be the official histories of the various imperial periods. And it contains several billion characters. So a large undertaking, which is still ongoing. The 25 standard histories, of course, are done now, are digitized, but they're constantly adding new material. So it's still an ongoing project there in Taipei. And led by a Hong Kong company, there's the Siku Quanshu, the complete library of the 4 branches, which is a huge compendium of books in the late 18th century. So 3,400 titles and of huge size as well. So it's done by a Hong Kong company, joined by scholars in the mainland, and the full version was released in 1999 in the form of CD-ROMs at that time, of course. So these really became standard go-to references for historians, especially those who are more enterprising, more receptive to new tech. But by the late 2000s and so on, these 2 databases, the 25 histories and the Siku Quanshu, have become so common among historians that even like very, very elderly senior scholars in their 70s and 80s, they also became accustomed to using these tools in their research. And these became like Google Books for Chinese history. And of course, considering the fact that Google Books was unveiled in 2004, and I think made available around 2006 or so. Actually, these databases for Chinese history are quite early, really, and they enabled a long wave of work based on keyword searches for retrieval of sources. And it's not just these canonical historical sources. There's also literary sources that are part of the main cultural canon. And it's in the mid 1980s when CAS, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, their literature institute, established a computer lab. And they also began digitizing many huge, large scale texts, including poetry, including prose, including encyclopedias. And I think most interesting of all is there's also a great men and women narrative to this origin story, and there's the the novel writer and famous literary scholar Qian Zhongshu, who directed the project. It was the story had that his daughter Qian Yuan, shown here, was visiting Leicester. So Qian Yuan herself was a linguist and literary scholar. So she visited Leicester in the UK as a visiting scholar and saw that concordances to Shakespearean works were being created at the time. And that sort of inspired the whole digitization project led by Qian Zhongshu at CAS. As for literary canonical texts, there's also the very important the Story of the Stone, or otherwise translated as Dream of the Red Chamber. It's also widely available in other languages because it's one of the most famous and important masterpieces of Chinese novels. And the main thing, sort of scholarly question about this novel was authorship. So there's the first 80 chapters and the last 40 chapters beyond the 80, and the authorship of the two, whether they are by the same person or by whom, is often debated, even up until now. So from the late 18th century until now, it has always been debated. Really heated topic, and of course, using machines to figure that out have been tried by scholars. So from the early 1980s, this has been done by Chen Bingzao, Bing Si Chan, who later taught in Hong Kong. So when in Wisconsin, he was working with co-authors to create computer programs to do a parts of speech and analysis of the text, so as to determine stylometrically whether the 40 chapters match the 80 chapters. So on the new computational analysis of an old and quite central problem in the humanities, in Chinese literary history. This slide is to show you that really this debate is still ongoing. The same questions are still being asked even now. So you see in 2019 an exhibit on this line of work brought out by Taiwan, the Central Library in Taiwan, and also a talk in 2023, which is also precisely on this issue of authorship of the Dream of the Red Chamber. So I talked about mentioned reorganization of material. So linguistic material, of course, a lot of them became digital, and a lot of reorganization was happening when they were transferred to computers. So dictionaries, dictionaries of dialects, of characters, but not just characters, but also of words, um, because the number of characters in one word could vary in the Chinese language. It could be a word could contain one character, it could contain two characters, it could be three or four, and so on. So both dictionaries of words and also of characters, these have been digitized in the 1990s as well, including in Hong Kong, where there's a center set up for humanities and computing, and also the reorganization of material in terms of concordances of these, again, canonical works for Chinese classics, especially of the Confucian tradition. This carries on a earlier tradition of print indexes and concordances, which dates back to the 1930s and 1940s, in fact. So we also see a lot of continuity, not just new tech bringing new potential and opportunities and junctures, but also continuities carry on the older work in the scholarly tradition. Just to give you a quick idea of what it was like, such as concordances to Taoist texts, the Taoist canon. So the Taoist canon, including several thousand texts, if you want to look up something in the whole canon, it's quite a hassle, right? Because it's not very neatly organized. So that's why if you want to look up a historical person, there you make use of an index like this and figure out the number of strokes, and then you look at the list of names, and there you find out where it was mentioned in a certain text in the Taoist canon. And of course, during the 1990s and so on, all these were being digitized, and databases were then created as a consequence. So the Chinese text project is a separate project, but now if you go on to Chinese text project, you could still see some of the traces of those works in digital form and also in its earlier analog print form. So there you see a lot of these texts with their concordances being incorporated into online databases now that are really already quite core to our work now. There are also some other strands, which for purposes of time, I won't go into details, including databases on modern Chinese intellectual history, or on HGIS, or on digitization of cultural artifacts, and so on. But really, this is to say from the 1980s to the 2000s, there have been increasing initiatives based on earlier scholarly traditions as well as newer research questions that are brought out. And the digitization initiatives, they also had quite a lot of state backing. For instance, in Taiwan, we see many waves of digitization initiatives from the late 1990s being funded and sponsored. This involves many participating organizations, as you can see to the right. These would be state-run departments or archives or libraries and museums and so on. And as for academia and university professors, there are also efforts to build communities such as DADH, which dates back to 2011. That's sort of the annual conference in Taiwan for DH, which contains, of course, a lot of digital history work, and the association, which now, of course, is part of ADHO and the book series and so on. Similar things are happening in the mainland in terms of state-sponsored projects and institutions from the GLAM sector taking part, digitizing, accumulating data for historical research, and so on. Sinologists are also joining this, and this includes CBDB, the China Biographical Database, which is run from 2005, and it's a joint collaboration between Peking in Beijing, Peking University, and also Academia Sinica and Taipei, and it's run by Harvard University. So it's a prosopographical project, and it focuses mainly on medieval China to late imperial China. So just to give you a glimpse of how we were digitizing sources about 10 years ago when I was still a postdoc there. So we borrowed the scanner, the high-speed scanner from Harvard Law School. And of course, scanning a lot of the pages from the print sources. We also had to be quite bad to the books because we have to cut them up into loose pages back then, and do OCR and proofreading, weeding out the inaccuracies, and drawing up spreadsheets of data about people. And then, of course, populating the database with more information about the historical figures and so on. Back then, it was a semi-automated process. Of course, now with a lot of machine learning, it's much more efficient than a decade ago. But back then, we were still using these sorts of structured, semi-automated digitization methods, which we wrote about back in the time. And of course, with this sort of data, you could imagine as historians what kind of analyses could be done. You could do geospatial analyses with CHGIS data. This is another GIS international project. It's a Harvard and Fudan in Shanghai collaboration. You could do visualization of the social network graphs, of course, with CBDB data in which the relations between people are accounted for. You could do a prosopographical or statistical analysis en masse of trends collectively of groups. You could tag texts based on those names and place names and period and rhyme names or book titles and so on and so forth. Many sorts of pathways, of course, which have all been done by historians of China. And so about from the 1980, the year 1980, when these standards came about, encoding standards, until 2009, I would argue really is the main period of the prehistory of Chinese DH. And of course, it's also in this year, in 2009, when the MLA had this thing that attracted everyone's attention there, and which is DH, right? In this blog post, it was called the next big thing, really. And actually, in the Chinese speaking world, that exact year, also marked the formal beginning of the paradigm of DH in both mainland China and Taiwan. So you see Xiangjie of Taiwan, and also Wang Xiaoguang of Wuhan in the mainland, and also the couple, Jing Guantao and Liu Qingfeng. They all wrote about DH in quite different ways. Probably they did not plan it ahead. They did not really talk to each other much before then, but they ominously wrote about DH in the same year. And actually, the blog post in which Wang Xiaoguang wrote about this could still be found. It's anthologized in this blog. And it's, as you can see, it's first posted in 2009, December of 2009. And that's where he writes about DH, the emergence and development and the frontiers of digital humanities. And this really sort of changed how everyone slotted these work. There wasn't this label before then in the Greater China region. But after the introduction of this paradigm, it took off gradually, but especially in the mid 2010s onwards, everyone in the field would know, oh, there's this new thing. There's this thing that, oh, is catching scholarly attention, DH. The discontents, of course, existed, and I'll say some more about it in a while. But DH, especially for digital history, since 2009, I would say, has attracted a lot of attention in the field. Although some scholars have been skeptical of digital practices entailed by the paradigm, or even rejected it, a good number of historians took part and actively used digital tools. Some assume that it's solely about using quantitative methods informed by cliometrics or quantitative history. And therefore, if they have that sort of idea, they might not have a lot of interest in it, because they might think, oh, that method is not what I'm accustomed to. That is not what I have been doing all along. So, okay, that's all good, but it's nothing to do with my own work. And therefore, for those groups of scholars, it's really not of real interest to them. And they often feel that, oh, I do my historical work, my research in so-called traditional methods. And so that's how I wrote. For those researchers, actually, they still use digital tools, of course, right? They acquire their sources, they look for their texts using electronic databases through full text keyword searches, allowing them, of course, to locate passages relevant to a certain theme or topic. And really, this sort of main mode of using digital tools and databases made it quite challenging to move beyond this default mode of using tools for historical research. Further utilization of the data, that is now, of course, we know as recognized as DH research, was still quite lacking in the 2010s or so. So although data have been accumulating, tools have been developed, it took quite some time. Since the mid 2010s, I think that we see a much more rapid institutionalization of the DH field, especially including for the history field, through university research centers, through academic programs, even including degree programs now in the 2020s, and also through outlets such as journals, Chinese academic journals, and so on. Scholars have also become more networked and more connected through the internet and starting to set up working groups, special interest groups, and working towards a scholarly association. And of course, since 2023 or so on, we see the huge explosion of LLM driven research and a lot of construction of customized and fine tuning of models. And in the Chinese academia, this would be phrased the 数字化 trend, which is the artificial intelligenceization of the humanities. 数字化 actually is quite like the pronunciation of digitization, 数字化. So that's sort of a play on words. It's another stage of digitization, a more sort of advanced stage using Gen AI. And long time in the making, publications and textbooks and resources for learning. So book series in which the first one is the translation of the defining DH reader, translated from English. I'm also part of this translation project. And so really, what I have said so far is to give you an overview, a really rough idea of the trajectory. So first of all, you see already that there is a lot of path dependence because of the features of the language, because the preponderance of print material, and because of the vast amounts of historical sources for Chinese history. The default mode for using digital historical data was accessing them through full text keyword searches in electronic databases. And that sort of default mode became something that had to be tackled. And therefore, it's the second sort of section of my sharing here, which is about infrastructure. And this second axis of part of my talk is asking a different question. So what sustains the emergence that we see in the first section? As we all know, any digital history work would not operate in a vacuum, and it will really depend on infrastructure, technical, institutional, epistemic, and also political infrastructure. And so in the Chinese context, the building of infrastructure, of course, is not merely technical, and it's really inseparable from questions of governance, of disciplinary organization, and also the governments, the state-led development. So here on, I will draw from a chapter that Jing Chen and I wrote for this edited volume here. This just came out in 2026, Critical Infrastructure Studies and DH. Actually, it's quite many years in the making, so I'm not sure it is, if we wrote this in 2026, we might have written it, we might have made it a lot more up to date. But still, a lot of the thoughts are staying with us. And in it, we examined how the idea of DH infrastructure has been negotiated and operationalized in China. So the term cyber infrastructure originates not in the humanities, but in the natural sciences. So there's the common sort of definition there, and also the NSF report, where it describes the distributed research environment, which includes a lot of things, right? It includes computing, storage, networking, data systems, and so on. It's not just a collection of tools, but it's an integrated set of resources. So when adapting this sort of concept of a cyber infrastructure for the humanities, when ACLS in the US does this, the assumption was that scholarly work in the humanities could similarly benefit from shared computational environments and interoperable data systems. But what motivated our question, in that chapter is that whether this model also travels easily into a very different scholarly context, such as China. So how was it translated and adapted in the Chinese context? So the distinction is already made in the ACLS report in 2003, our cultural commonwealth between tangible and intangible. So I won't go into the specifics here, but really we see both dimensions at play also in the Chinese landscape, in Chinese discussions of DH infrastructure. The tangible dimension, especially the hardware and large-scale data systems, often receive more policy emphasis, particularly because infrastructure in China was often seen as state-driven, policy-informed, and shaped by the government, because it has long been associated with material construction and national and regional development and so on. But this distinction, the tangible and the intangible, I think is still crucial, because for the humanities, the intangible is super important, right? The standards, the interoperability, the way that scholars see things, right? And how they work together, how they connect. That's often the more transformative and more critical layer. So I also would like to draw from this study from Waters, the workflow of a digitized humanities workflow, to show that DH, including digital history work, is procedural, right? It's a structured processes, including these processes that he lists. And each of these steps require standards, such as TEI, such as metadata schemas, such as authority files, and so on. So in our study, we argued that one of the central challenges for Chinese academia has been precisely the proliferation of databases without enough coordination of standards and formats. So it's not a lack of digitization. As you can see, I already mentioned a lot of these huge scale, large databases, digitization projects. The problem is the lack of interoperability, and it's infrastructure that stabilizes these workflows and allows these workflows to really function for the humanities. So ideally, such an infrastructure should enable sharing and communication. And for the field of Chinese history, I think it's quite urgent, because the scale and the dispersion of historical materials is already alluded to by me in the first section of the talk. And so there, I would like to turn to some of the examples, including, again, to mention once more, the CBDB, which is helping to illustrate the scale of the challenge. So for biographies in Chinese history, it spans at least 2,000 years. Lots of different genres of biographies written about people. So the problem is not just digitization, but organization, right? Even if you have all these in digital form, over 100 years, 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 100 2 million biographies or texts about people, how do you organize them, right? How do you make use of those data? And that's sort of the question that drove the China Biographical Database. And so really, when this database was built, it was not only just a tool for accessing the historical data about people, because it was touching on so many aspects of historical sources. It became a standards producing project. It's codes tables. That's how we call it in the project. The tables for names, calendrical dates, administrative units, official titles, relationships, so on and so forth. Those standards also contribute to how we organize digitized historical data. And that's really what moves a project from being just a large data set to being an infrastructural project. So last year we just had, I also joined this 20th anniversary of the project of CBDB. So resource sharing, including the implementation of APIs, which stabilizes access and allows for customizable formats of the output from CBDB or from other interoperable projects, of course. So interoperable projects, including between CBDB and tagging platforms like Marcus, or between text repositories like ctext, and so on, linking the two layers. So both the underlying technologies and the scholarly platforms that provide the services, including the place names, right, from GIS project. That also has an API, China Historical API. So all the place names that are mentioned in sources, if you want to use them to tag a certain source in, let's say, in TEI format, there you could use it in this interoperable way. And the structural context is also, how are these projects being made sustainable, right? If they are just ad hoc or just short-term funding projects, it's really, really hard to have these huge infrastructural initiatives run for many, many years. So there's also outreach and also some parts of it being commercialized in subscription models or development of further tools by the community, right? Which is really working outside academic institutions, just out of love, right? Out of interest in the history, developing platforms online, drawing the data from the database to make it available for use by netizens. If they want to look up a certain person and their networks, here's a platform that a netizen has developed, which sometimes is even easier to use than the database itself, because it's community driven. So these are some of the things that we really are happy to see. So infrastructure in the context of the region, really. So what has to be asked, I think, is also for whom and by whom, right? It's only around 2016 that we see explicit discussions of humanities research infrastructure in China. So about 10 years, and it's about 20 years when we, in the past 20 years, that we see the word infrastructure being associated with more than just buildings and material things. So including science and research and data and so on. So we see that sort of development in China. And these words that sprang up, some of them more commonly used than others, but we see these uh, these uh, these lingual, these terms and these jargon being used in government policy papers as well. So I won't bore you with the policy papers, just to list them to show to you that they began mentioning them in the national level science and tech policies as well, including scholars beginning to talk about DH infrastructure, arguing that we in the humanities also need a research infrastructure. So in a way, some argue that we are literature dependent, so we need coordinated ways of accessing the literature, right? The materials, especially the text and so on. And so in the study, we canvass and survey and also evaluate critically some of the approaches to these terms and also the discussions that arise from them. And I think they reveal some sort of negotiation going on there. There's no unified program for the humanities in China that is like Daria or Eric in Europe. So instead, I think there are a lot of conceptual debates at the macro level and some actual concrete initiatives at the micro level, but no systematic national framework for research infrastructure. So for whom is it built then? The first, of course, as a state-driven initiative in the late 2010s and now in the 2020s. It's called the new digital infrastructure. So they're trying to bring about transformative digitization, and especially now driven by a lot by AI tech as well. And of course, the AI competition, which is going on globally. And the second drive we see is by the GLAM sectors. So these institutions, these archives, libraries, and museums, and so on, they want more sort of coordinated access and services among themselves. So these serve quite specific types of cultural data. And the third, of course, would be more closer to home or closer to people like us, would be DH infrastructure. So mostly developed by researchers and research groups, and a lot of them in universities and so on. But still, the challenges remain. Main reason is, of course, it's not easy for any individual to just promote or push for this agenda. A lot of the resources are quite challenging, and needs a lot of collective effort. And the second question is, I think, is that the participation of humanists are still relatively lacking. Most of these participants are from libraries or university IT centers or proprietary databases, so commercial companies. So in the interest of time, I won't go through the cases, but in the paper, we actually go through the case studies, and I'll make available the paper as well. So several platforms that we talk about in the paper. So really to summarize what I've been talking about infrastructure so far, the tensions remain in the field for digital humanities and digital history. So the tension between top-down policy versus bottom-up disruption and creative endeavors, often centralization versus the diversity, and also state backing versus academic creativity, including outside institutions and universities in the community, between scale and sustainability, and also between commercial interests and scholarly control. These tensions really sort of define what the DH field are facing right now. And so I know that I've been going on for quite a long time now. So let me draw this to a close, and I'll quickly offer you my quick thoughts. So first of all, the volume here is available open access, so feel free to look it up, and it's all online and free of charge. And I really haven't gone on much about the discontents, but I've already talked about the critique by some of the mainstream historians. So as you can see, what I've gone on so far, the Chinese DH field has a pretty long and rich history. And it's really built on the exploration, rooting, going back, originating from the earliest, late 60s, but more so from the 1980s until the 2000s, and until 2009 when this paradigm really was formally introduced. And now we have already vast amounts of data and a lot of diverse tools for the field. It's really not a sudden sort of revolution, and it's also not a mere transplant. Of course, the paradigm was introduced and translated, but it became a label as well. It became a label to repackage a lot of the things that have been going on for a long time. And it was also a convenient label for getting resources, such as from state-backed and university initiatives and so on and so forth, academic funds and so on. This also is a complex, long-winding, and meandering process. It's not like a sudden digitization transforming everything, but rather, several decades of work and accumulation and back and forth, a lot of debate going on, especially within the mainstream. I write in one of my papers that it's about 2016 or 17 when digital history work became featured in several top journals in the Chinese-speaking world. So it really took quite a long time, right? From the earliest work until 2016 or 17, when they became acceptable, so-called. Debates about these, of course, are ongoing in the mainstream sort of history academia in the Chinese-speaking world. And I know I really do not have 5 hours to talk about what I really, really close to my heart. So here I offer up some of the papers that I, write about these in larger length, and feel free to download them. Even if it's Chinese nowadays, easy to machine translate, right? So some of these are in English, some of these in Chinese, but deals with various aspects of digital history in China. So I'll share the slides with you afterwards as well. But these are the QR codes of these several papers on the topics that I've touched upon so far. But in the interest of time, let me shut up now and really invite you to comment and ask questions. And I really look forward to your thoughts. Thank you.